Welcome to Life Stories, where real-life journeys unfold with love, resilience, and personal growth. Today's story is about breaking free from expectations and choosing a path of true happiness. Emma Carter had everything: a privileged upbringing, a future mapped out by her parents, but she longed for something more. When she fell in love with Jake, a humble carpenter, her family disowned her, forcing her to choose between love and the life she had always known. What happened next is a tale of struggle, perseverance, and self-discovery. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. I was born into a world of expectations, ones that were meticulously crafted long before I even took my first breath. My parents, Dr. William Carter and Susan Carter, were a force of ambition and tradition. My father, a highly regarded professor at one of the top universities in the country, had built a career on discipline, intellect, and an unwavering belief in excellence. My mother, though not academically inclined, had dedicated herself to upholding the perfect image of our family, ensuring that every detail, from our clothes to our manners, reflected the high standards they held. Growing up in Boston, my twin sister Olivia and I were often compared, though the comparisons were never in my favor. Olivia was the epitome of success, sharp-minded, diligent, and naturally gifted in everything she pursued. She excelled in business administration, effortlessly fulfilling our parents' dreams of raising accomplished, refined daughters. She embraced the structure, the rules, and the high standards they set. Meanwhile, I always felt like an outsider in my own home, struggling to mold myself into the version of a daughter they wanted. I tried, for years, to fit their vision. I dressed as they expected me to, studied tirelessly to meet their academic standards, and followed the path they had laid out for me. But no matter how much I tried, I always felt like I was living someone else's life. There was something in me, something restless, something that longed to breathe outside the suffocating walls of my family's expectations. At first, my acts of defiance were small. I experimented with my clothing, shifting away from the polished, pre-approved looks my mother preferred to something more expressive: darker eyeliner, colors that weren't elegant but felt more like me. I started spending time in places that weren't considered proper for someone of my background: small cafes where artists gathered, bookshops filled with poetry and philosophy, and workshops where people created with their hands instead of theories and financial models. My parents saw these changes as temporary, a phase I would grow out of. "Emma, you'll understand when you're older," my mother would say with a soft sigh, as if my search for my own identity was simply youthful rebellion. But I wasn't rebelling for the sake of it. I was searching for something real, something that felt like home. Then, I met Jake. It happened on a cold autumn evening in the university library. I was buried under textbooks, overwhelmed by an assignment I had no passion for, when I heard the sound of laughter, genuine, full-bodied laughter that seemed out of place in such a serious setting. I looked up, and there he was, a man with calloused hands and warm brown eyes, leaning against the bookshelf, talking to a friend. His presence radiated a kind of ease, a quiet confidence that was so different from the rigid posturing I was used to seeing in the academic world. He noticed me staring and gave me a small smile. "That assignment got you feeling like the world's ending?" he asked, nodding toward my open book. I let out a dry laugh. "Something like that." That was the first of many conversations. Jake wasn't a student. He was a carpenter who often came to the library to research woodworking techniques. Unlike the people I had grown up around, he didn't measure success by wealth or social status. He found beauty in simple things: carving a chair from a raw piece of wood, watching the seasons change, working with his hands to create something lasting. He fascinated me. With Jake, I felt something I had never felt before: freedom. There were no expectations, no pressure to be someone I wasn't. I could speak my mind without worrying about disappointing him. I could be silent without the need to fill the space with forced conversation. Being with him was like finally exhaling after years of holding my breath. When he asked me to marry him, I knew without hesitation what my answer would be. But I also knew what it would mean. Introducing Jake to my parents was one of the hardest things I had ever done. The moment we stepped into the house, I could feel the tension coil in the air. My father, seated in his study surrounded by books and papers, barely looked up when we entered. My mother, who had been preparing dinner, froze at the sight of him. "MIA," she said, forcing a polite smile. "And, who is this?" I swallowed hard. "Mom. Dad. This is Jake. He's a carpenter. And he's very important to me." The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken words. My father finally set his pen down and looked at Jake for the first time. "Tell me about yourself," he said, his tone distant, measured. Jake, ever the calm and steady presence, smiled warmly. "I build furniture. I love what I do. And I believe in living life on my own terms." The dinner that followed was one of the most painful experiences of my life. Every attempt I made to lighten the mood was met with cold indifference. My father watched Jake as though he were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve, while my mother avoided looking at him entirely, her hands clenched in her lap. After dinner, my father called me into his study. I knew what was coming, but nothing could have prepared me for the weight of his words. "MIA," he said, his voice grave. "We've always had expectations for you. We've worked hard to give you a future that means something. This choice you're making, it's throwing away everything we've built." I took a deep breath, steadying my voice. "I see the impact, Dad. But I have to live my own life. Not the one you planned for me. Jake makes me happy. Isn't that enough?" My mother's voice trembled. "We just want what's best for you." I looked at them, two people I loved so deeply, but who couldn't see me beyond the version of myself they had created in their minds. "Your vision of what's best for me isn't the same as what I need for myself." The silence that followed was suffocating. I could see the pain in their eyes, the disappointment, the disbelief. But there was no going back. That night, I left their house knowing that the life I had always known had come to an end. I had chosen Jake. And in doing so, I had finally chosen myself. The night I walked away from my parents' house, the weight of my decision pressed heavily on my chest. I kept telling myself I had done the right thing, that choosing love, choosing my own happiness, was the only path forward. But even with Jake's warm hand in mine, steady and reassuring, a part of me ached in a way I hadn't anticipated. For years, I had longed to break free from their expectations. Yet standing outside their house, disowned and unwelcome, I felt the sting of loss. Not just of my parents, but of the certainty and security that came with their approval. I wasn't just leaving behind their rules, I was leaving behind a part of myself. The version of me who had tried so desperately to make them proud. Jake didn't say anything as we drove back to his apartment. He just held my hand, rubbing his thumb across my skin in slow, soothing circles. He knew I wasn't ready to talk. That was one of the things I loved about him. He never pressured me to be anything other than what I was in that moment. His apartment was small. Nothing like the pristine, perfectly curated home I had grown up in. The walls weren't adorned with expensive artwork. The furniture didn't match, and the wooden coffee table had visible scratches from years of use. And yet, the moment I stepped inside, I felt something I had never felt before in my parents' house. I felt at home. That night, as I curled up on his worn-out but cozy couch, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like sawdust and Jake's cologne, I allowed myself to grieve. He sat beside me in silence, letting me cry, letting me mourn the loss of a family that had already made it clear they wouldn't come looking for me. "I'm sorry," I finally whispered. "For what?" His voice was calm, patient. "For dragging you into this. For making you part of this mess." Jake let out a soft chuckle and shook his head. "Emma, you didn't drag me into anything. I chose this. I chose you." His words settled into my heart like an anchor, grounding me. In the days that followed, I tried to adapt to my new life. But reality quickly set in. Being cut off from my family meant I was truly on my own, no financial support, no safety net. My parents had always made sure Olivia and I had everything we needed. And now, for the first time, I was struggling to afford even the most basic necessities. Jake did his best to reassure me. "We'll figure it out together," he promised. But I could see the worry in his eyes. He wasn't rich, his carpentry business was small. And while he was good at what he did, it wasn't the kind of job that brought in a steady paycheck. Some weeks were good. Others barely covered rent. I took on whatever work I could find, waitressing at a local diner, tutoring students who needed help with their essays, even cleaning houses when money was tight. It was exhausting, humbling work. But for the first time, every dollar I earned felt like mine. Not my parents'. Not part of some predetermined path, they were mine. The result of my own choices. Still, it wasn't easy. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had made a mistake. If love was enough to sustain a life. If I should have just done what my parents wanted. Married someone they approved of. Lived the life they had planned for me. But then there were moments, small, beautiful moments, that reminded me why I had chosen this path. Mornings where Jake would wake up before me and leave a cup of coffee on the nightstand. Just the way I liked it. Evenings spent sitting on the floor, eating cheap takeout, laughing about the terrible customers we had encountered that day. Late nights when he would pull me into his arms and whisper, "No matter how hard this gets, I don't regret a single second with you." And slowly, I started to believe it too. One night, as we lay on the couch, tangled in each other's warmth, Jake turned to me and said, "I know things are tough right now, but I promise you, Emma, it won't always be this way. I have plans. Big ones." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? Like what?" He grinned, a spark of excitement in his eyes. "I'm going to grow my business. Get certified in more advanced woodworking techniques. Maybe even open my own workshop one day." I felt a familiar warmth bloom in my chest. This wasn't just blind optimism. Jake had a way of making even the simplest dreams feel possible. And for the first time since leaving my parents' house, I realized something. I wasn't just surviving. I was building something. Something real. Something that was mine. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth every hardship along the way. Months passed. And life became a series of small victories and quiet struggles. Jake and I were building a future. But the road was far from easy. The weight of being cut off from my family still lingered in my heart. Especially when I walked past places that reminded me of them, a bookstore my mother and I used to visit. The coffee shop where my father would meet his colleagues. Their absence was a silent wound. One I tried not to dwell on. But some nights, when the world was quiet, I couldn't help but wonder if they ever thought of me. Meanwhile, Jake worked tirelessly to expand his carpentry business. He took on extra projects, often coming home late, his hands rough from hours of sanding and carving. He never complained. But I could see the exhaustion in his posture. The quiet way he winced when he stretched his sore muscles. "You don't have to push yourself this hard," I told him one evening as he rubbed his aching wrists. He smiled, leaning over to kiss my forehead. "I'm not just working for me, Emma. I'm working for us." His determination was unwavering. And it made me love him even more. But love alone wasn't enough to pay the bills. Money was tight, sometimes painfully so. There were days when I had to choose between groceries and rent. And weeks where my bank account barely held enough to get us through. The financial safety net I had grown up with no longer existed. And the reality of that hit me hardest when unexpected expenses arose, a broken heater in the middle of winter. A medical bill Jake hadn't planned for. I took on more work to help ease the burden. In the mornings, I waitressed at the diner, smiling through exhaustion as I poured coffee for regulars who barely noticed me. In the afternoons, I tutored students, helping them craft essays that I secretly wished I could be writing for myself. And in the evenings, I helped Jake with his business, managing his appointments, organizing his invoices, doing anything I could to help him stay on track. It was exhausting. But through it all, we had each other. Some nights, when the stress felt unbearable, we'd escape to the rooftop of our apartment building, a blanket wrapped around us as we looked out over the city. One day, Jake would whisper, pointing at the distant skyline, "We're going to have a place of our own. A home we built together." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that this struggle was temporary, that one day we'd look back on these nights and laugh about how far we'd come. But then, my past came knocking. It was a Sunday afternoon when I ran into Olivia. I had just finished a tutoring session at the library when I heard her voice, sharp, polished, and unmistakably familiar. "Emma." I turned. And there she was, standing near the entrance in a crisp, tailored coat, her blonde hair pulled into a sleek bun. She looked exactly as I remembered, poised, elegant, everything my parents had always wanted me to be. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, she sighed and crossed her arms. "You look different." "I suppose I am," I replied, unsure of whether to feel hurt or indifferent. She studied me, her expression unreadable. "Mom and Dad still ask about you. You know." My heart clenched. "Really?" Olivia hesitated. "Well, Mom does. Dad, not so much." I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the lump forming in my throat. "What do they say?" "That they don't understand why you threw everything away. That you had so much potential." And now, she trailed off, shaking her head. "Emma, do you really think this is what you want? Struggling like this?" I clenched my fists. "I'm not struggling, Olivia. I'm building something." She let out a soft sigh. "You always were the stubborn one." For a fleeting second, I thought she might say something kind, something that acknowledged my choices with respect. But instead, she simply straightened her coat and said, "If you ever decide to come back, you know where to find us." And just like that, she was gone. I stood there for a long time, my emotions tangled in a mess of anger, sadness, and longing. I wanted to brush off her words, to tell myself they didn't matter. But they did. Because no matter how much I had tried to move on, a part of me still craved their approval. That night, as I sat beside Jake in our tiny apartment, I told him about the encounter. He listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he took my hand and squeezed it. "Emma, I know it hurts, but you don't have to prove anything to them. You're enough, just as you are." His words, so simple yet so profound, settled deep within me. I wasn't living for them anymore. I was living for myself. Years passed, and Jake and I built a life we were proud of. His carpentry business flourished, and together, we bought a small but beautiful home on the outskirts of Denver. Every corner of that house held a piece of our journey: the dining table Jake handcrafted, the bookshelves he built for me, and the nursery we prepared when we found out we were expecting our son, Carter. Despite the struggles, despite the pain of losing my family's approval, I never regretted my choice. My parents never truly reconciled with me, but I learned that happiness isn't about pleasing others, it's about living authentically, surrounded by the people who truly love and accept you. As I stood in our home, watching Jake play with Carter, I knew that I had finally found what I had been searching for all along: a life that was truly mine. Subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring real-life tales.